Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one. This time we'll be looking at the Atlantic revolutions. Today we'll be looking at the ones in Haiti and Latin America, kind of picking up where we left off. Last time we looked at the United States and France and how those revolutions were bred from Enlightenment ideas. This time we're going to see that those same sort of liberal ideologies coming out of the United States and France during the revolution are going to inspire other revolutions around the Atlantic, particularly in Haiti, and then kind of all over Latin America, giving us a lot of the sort of state structures and sort of nations that we know today. So first, we'll look at the Haitian Revolution and see how that compares with the French Revolution and the American Revolution, how that sort of developed in the Caribbean. Then we'll look at the revolutions from Mexico to Argentina. Then we'll get a sense of the sort of limitation of these revolutions and whether or not it actually meant something, whether they worked, whether it was worth the sort of effort, who benefits, all those sorts of questions. So we should start with the Haitian Revolution. It's kind of next in line. Traditionally, this was taught like the twin revolutions, with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. But then people started to say, hey, there was another revolution just like right after that in Haiti that was very much the same. So now people kind of look at these all together and try to understand how they're connected. The Haitian Revolution is going to pick up kind of where the French Revolution left off. It's going to mix in, American ideas. We'll try to get a sense of that. So where is Haiti, or this sort of area? It wasn't Haiti at the time. It was this big island. It's the second, actually, I think it's the biggest sort of island in the Caribbean. And it was kind of split into different pieces. Hispaniola had been colonized originally by the Spanish, right? Remember, this is where the Taino people were, that Columbus kind of first meets and stuff like that. But where we're cutting into the history around 625 or so, there was a French colony on one end, and then the Spanish colony kind of on the other end. So if you look at that top map, you can see Saint Domingo, right, is the French one, and then Santo Domingo is the Spanish one on the other side. By the end of this revolution, kind of today, you see this shape taking place where you have Haiti on one side of the island, and then now you have the Dominican Republic on the other side of the island. And the legacy of that is from, who they were originally colonized by. So as a French colony, Santo Domingo was extremely important to the French Empire. It produced tons of wealth for France. 60% of all the coffee Europeans were drinking, 40% of all the sugar they were eating, tons of cotton was coming out of these plantations that were on, the western side of the island. So for the French Empire, this was like a major moneymaker. It was a central sort of piece of the French Empire, especially the early French Empire. But it was also establishing some really complex sort of social structures on the island. So just like we looked at in the Spanish case and the Portuguese case, race in the Americas, especially early on, operated really differently. There was lots of different things going on, definitely not just black and white. There was a whole sort of mix and sort of racial hierarchy that you might not necessarily expect. So in Santo Domingo, the highest sort of racial category was French-born elites. So if you were white and wealthy and actually born in France, you were like way up the class scale. What you could do, the laws that applied to you were all very different. But right under you was a sort of different category that's a little bit unexpected, the gens de couleur. So the gens de couleur were black folks who were free, either because they had purchased their freedom, or they were freeborn, or they were freedmen, but they were also wealthy, and they were also in this sort of like elite or upper middle class. They sometimes owned plantations, they owned ships, they had jobs within the government, stuff like this. So actually, a sort of class of black folks who were fairly affluent. Then under them were the petits blancs. These are like poor whites, right? So these are people like little whites, right? These are French subjects who have immigrated to the island to fill in a lot of sort of middle class jobs or middling roles, but they're not wealthy. They're not elites. They don't have a lot of political or military power. And then finally, under them, the vast majority of people on the island were enslaved African folks. And as we looked at before when we talked about the transatlantic slave trade, there's a high turnover, right? Because death rate is really high on these islands. The work is really intense, and slaves are managed in such a way that often leads to their early death. So most of the slaves on the island would have been born in Africa. So these are not necessarily people who have been on the island for a long time, although there are some of those as well. So it's a really complex sort of racial and caste system on the island when this sort of early revolution is going to start. Well, how does it come to happen? Well, there's a revolution in France, right? And we started looking at that. When that happens, uh, all around the French Empire, people know what's going on to an extent. And in Haiti, a particular thing happens that's going to trigger this sort of massive event. Basically, when there's a revolution in France and the National Assembly declares, the Bill of Rights for citizens and stuff, of the rights of man and citizen, then there's this rumor that's going to sweep through the island that the French king has somehow or for some reason declared all the slaves are free. This can be a really powerful sort of thing, right? If you're enslaved and all of a sudden you hear that the king back in France has freed everybody, it starts to put sort of ideas into your mind that might not have been there before about the sort of legitimacy of a rebellion or that you're entitled to end your bondage. But not everybody is obviously on board with that. There's that other category we talked about, the Petit Blancs, that they're going to really identify with the third estate in France. So if you remember, the third estate is like the main body of the people that want change. So all of these sort of poor whites in the colony feel like they're being repressed by white elites, by gens de couleur, and they want more rights and democracy exactly the same as the folks in France. And this is often expressed within sort of economic terms. But they only want rights and new sort of liberties for white folks. If slaves were all freed or something, they'd have a big problem. And so the poor whites in Haiti don't want the slaves freed. They don't want rights for any of those folks. They just want more rights for themselves along the lines of the people in the revolution. Finally, you have the gens de couleur. These are the ones actually reading, pamphlets and newspapers and the actual declarations coming out of France and stuff like this. And what they kind of understand as a revolution is in the air, and they start to think about what their role is going to be, who they might side with if things happen. And it's not entirely clear who they will side with. A lot of them had a revolutionary impulse because they had been part of revolutions before. Many of the gens de couleur had actually fought in the American Revolutionary War, which is kind of crazy, right? You have people who had fought in the American Revolutionary War that somehow ended up in Haiti. Now a revolution is coming there. So they kind of have a little bit of background. They have a little bit of idea about what's going on. So it doesn't take very long, only within about 5 years or so, and the island is going to erupt into this sort of multi-sided war where it's unclear who's fighting who or who's on which side. So as the revolution proceeds in France and the National Assembly gets going, there's a lot of sort of confusion about what the role of French citizens or subjects are going to be, especially out in the colonies. And the Petit Blancs organize and make their move. They want rights. They're going to try to emulate what the National Assembly is doing. So they seize the capital city, Port-au-Prince, and basically start to agitate that they're part of the revolution. They're just like the National Assembly back in France, and they want rights too. So this leads to some conflict and problems, especially because the French National Assembly is going to do something kind of out of nowhere, right? They're getting really liberal over there in France, and they declare that all of the free men of color are citizens as well. So if you're part of the French Empire and you're a free man of color, which means one, you have to be wealthy, and two, you can't actually be the child of a slave. So if you happen to have bought your freedom or have been emancipated in some other means, it doesn't necessarily count. But if you're a free man of color, you're now a citizen, which is not a ton of people, but it's definitely a lot of those gens de color. So the gens de color have been given rights by the new sort of French government. So they don't necessarily want the Petit Blancs getting in their way. The Petit Blancs don't want the gens de color to have rights, right? So they're at each other's throats. Then, in the midst of this, there's a slave revolt on the island. So remember, there was that rumor that all the slaves had been freed. There were tens of thousands of enslaved folks. In fact, they were the majority of the people. And they start to organize and have their own sort of revolution. So you have 3 or 4 different kind of competing factions all fighting each other on the island. Out of this, someone's going to sort of rise to the top to give these revolutions a shape and sort of direct the island towards kind of a more national revolution. Toussaint Louverture is the man's name. Here he is. He's a really interesting guy. He became a freedman in 1776. It's a good year to get free, I guess, right? The American Revolution and stuff like that. He is initially going to join up with the rebels when the slave revolt happens. Even though he's a gens de color, he's wealthy, he's not a slave, he's able to sort of mix and mingle and get people to sort of form up and fight around a shared context. So here you have this gens de color that's been trained, obviously in horse riding and combat, in military strategy. He's building up an army of these formerly enslaved folks who have rebelled, and he takes the fight to the French. So he's not fighting to be French or necessarily to get rights within the French Empire. He's now fighting for a free nation state for the enslaved folks, or the formerly enslaved folks on the island. So the French army is pretty quickly, defeated. There weren't necessarily a lot of them stationed there, and the French government is going to try other means to keep these folks on board. So the first thing they're going to do in 1794, after Louverture has been pretty successful, is they're going to free all the slaves. So the reason that they choose to do this is they're hoping that this is going to somehow sweeten the pot and keep people as part of the empire. Remember, this island is incredibly productive and adds to the wealth of the French Empire, so they don't want it to leave. Instead, they're hoping that they're going to be able to kind of lure these people back in. So as they're working on this, the sort of new Haitian government is forming. There's this group, mostly ex-slaves, but also some gens de color, that are getting together, and they're thinking about what they're going to do. They seem to be having military victory after victory. The French army can't really keep up. The Petit Blancs can't really keep up. Other gens de color are coming to their side because it looks like they're winning. So by 1797, the Overture and his army seem to be really in control of most of the western part of the island, all the former territory of Santo Domingo. So he has, by this point, maybe 20,000 soldiers that are really crack troops that have really fought in various formats against different armies. Once all the war is kind of settled, Louverture is going to be in charge. There's a new sort of government. He promulgates a constitution. It's not necessarily democratic. It's a little bit different, but he says a couple things in the constitution that are really interesting. All citizens, basically everybody on the island is a citizen, and everybody has rights based on that citizenship. So regardless of color or class. If you live on the island, you're a citizen. This is really funky. This is like way ahead of what other people are doing. And this comes directly out of those ideas of enslaved people being brought to the island and having no rights. But one thing that the Overture is sort of a sticking point is this new nation that they're forming needs money. Okay, great, right? Haiti produces all of this stuff, coffee and sugar and cotton, but it had produced those things under the slave system. So unfortunately, L'Ouverture realizes that if they stop doing all that, the island won't have much money. How are they going to defend themselves? How are they going to get this new nation rolling? So L'Ouverture encourages people, all of these ex-slaves, to go back to the plantation. He wants them to start working again in the fields to sort of generate income for the new government. But the problem is, most of these enslaved peoples had horrible experiences on these plantations. They don't want to go back. Now that they're free, why would they go back to, toiling under a similar system? So there's a little bit of a growing rift, even though L'Ouverture was this amazing general who really led the people and basically won independence with his army for Haiti. His sort of economic policy to put Haiti back where it was as a sort of producer for European goods, even though the money would have been for the Haitian people, wasn't really popular. While all of that's going on, Napoleon is coming to power in France, and he hopes to really get the French Empire back on track. Remember, he had himself crowned, he sees himself as like the center of an empire. So Haiti was one of the crown jewels of empire. So Napoleon really wants it back. There can't just be some slave insurrection and giving it up. So Napoleon in 1802, just a year after the Constitution is promulgated there in Haiti, sends 40,000 French troops, a huge army, to Haiti to retake it, to recolonize. But he's not very successful. Early on, the French army, when they're like at full strength, they do have some victories. They manage to capture L'Ouverture. He's sent back to France, where he's put in prison, and actually he dies in prison pretty quickly after getting back to France. But the French army doesn't do well. Overall, they start to lose. And this happens for a lot of reasons. One of the main things that happens is the Haitians are very smart about the sort of geographical features and climate features of the island. And they realize these French troops don't know anything about this. So they set up barricades and they basically direct the French to encamp in areas that, although they were dry at the moment, the wet season was coming. The French wouldn't have known this. The French encamp at some of these sites. The wet season comes. These places that they're encamped turn into marshes. There's tons of mosquitoes. The mosquitoes give the French yellow fever. Within a year, the French army has just been decimated by these sorts of tropical diseases. And this is strangely ironic because it was Europeans in the first place who had brought mosquitoes and these diseases to the Caribbean, but these French troops had never been outside of France by and large. Maybe some of them had been to Egypt and stuff like that, but probably not most. And so they were completely unprepared to deal with this sort of disease load, and many of them die from that. Within only a year, out of those 40,000 troops that were sent to Haiti, only 8,000 are still alive, and they have to get out of there. It's an absolute disaster. But before they leave, they do a tremendous amount of damage. They burn cities, they burn plantations, they kill a ton of people. They really mess up all of the sort of agricultural and industrial potential that was there in Haiti that made it so productive when it was a colony. So the French lose, but they do so much damage that maybe it's just done anyway. When the French leave, um, they basically abandoned the island to the Haitians. 1803, they leave. The Haitian generals declare victory. The ones that are still alive, the ones that sort of made it through the long revolution. Um, so January 1st, 1804, Haiti is an independent state. This is crazy because it's only the second independent republic in the whole Western Hemisphere, and it's the only successful sort of slave rebellion that turned into a nation state like this. It's really incredible at a time when, in most of the world, the idea of like a black state was just like a fantasy or something. Like Europeans thought this was absolutely insane. But Haitians really fought for it and they got it. Um, it's really amazing. But this story is often not told that much. It's often sort of swept aside, in part because of the sort of outcome. So even though the Haitians get independence, it doesn't mean that people in the Caribbean are all free or that other people are going to be successful. When the Haitians win, actually it sends out this sort of shockwave of fear across the Caribbean and into the United States, particularly into Southern American states. So this is when you actually see more aggressive sort of repression of black folks starting in places like Louisiana, Missouri, Mississippi. Um, it had been there, of course, but the idea, like in Missouri and Mississippi, for example, the majority of the population was black. So these Southern slave owners were like, oh my God, they're seeing images like this in newspapers where Europeans were being hung or where black folks had picked up weapons. And this really puts fear into the hearts of a lot of American Southerners who are white, who own slaves, who support that system. Because if it could happen there, why couldn't it happen in the American South? So you actually see a lot more sort of repressive laws and sort of ideas put in place to sort of combat this fear. Also, the whole island of Hispaniola, larger island that includes the Dominican Republic, just suffered an absolute crushing economic and population loss from this revolution, and it never fully recovered. So it doesn't become a sort of dream democratic state for Black folks in the Caribbean. Unfortunately, so much damage is done, and the French don't want to trade with them anymore, and all these sorts of things, that Haiti remains pretty impoverished for a long time, and it doesn't quite ever get back to the sort of promise it had when Overture promulgated the Constitution and sort of originally started things out. Further, it has weird implications for things like the Louisiana Purchase. You might have just heard in high school or middle school when you learned about the Louisiana Purchase that it was French and America bought it in 1803. No particular reason. But actually, Napoleon sold it to the United States because of the Haitian Revolution. So after the Haitian Revolution, the French army just gets crushed, and Napoleon just is done with empire in the Americas. His idea is, look, we're too far away. Things are not going well for us out there. Let's just cut our losses, and we can sell these sort of giant holdings that we have in the Americas, and that can help him, prosecute his wars in Europe. But also, it's just one less sort of headache. So it's kind of crazy because the Haitian Revolution really does lead directly to the massive expansion of the United States. But it's often not necessarily taught that way, right? So just as in Haiti, we're going to see that across Latin America, all kinds of racial and class conflicts are going to pick up on these ideas of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and they're going to start to have their own um, independence movements. But the sort of racial and class system in the Americas is so complex and so different that what you see in Latin America doesn't quite match up with what was going on elsewhere. Remember, we had the sort of Peninsulares and the Creoles, so you get a very different sort of system. So here's Latin America sort of on the eve of revolution. You can see the various sort of expansions of empire. So you have New Spain, right, kind of going all the way down, California, Mexico, right? New Granada was the sort of northern part of South America, right, in the Spanish Empire. Then you had Buenos Aires, right, that sort of area in the south. That was the sort of southern part of the Spanish Empire, and Brazil, this like massive chunk, right, of Portuguese Empire. So primarily Latin America was still controlled by Spain and Portugal during this time, but it was kind of funky who was actually in charge and who was actually in power. So there were about 30,000 peninsulares in Latin America overall. These, remember, were people who were either born in Spain or born in Portugal, and then they come to the Americas to manage the empire. These are the most elite, the sort of highest racial and class group. But right under them, you had about 3.5 million Creoles. These were their children or descendants over the last hundreds of years. So Creoles were Spanish or Portuguese folks who were born in the Americas. So they had land, they had money, they had a growing sort of racial and class consciousness as somehow different from the people back in Europe. They often were educated in Europe, they often had European parents, right? But if they were born in the Americas, they were somehow sort of different. In places like Brazil, as we saw for the transatlantic slave trade, that's actually where the majority of enslaved people are taken. Actually, the vast majority of the population in Brazil were Black folks, right? Many of them by this point, though, it's not first generation, they're like third, fourth, fifth generation living in Brazil. Also, all over the Americas, you have just absolute crazy mixes of people and cultures, as we looked at before, mestizos, mulattoes, indigenous Americans, all kinds of stuff. And these people all have either certain levels of sort of repression or rights based on where they slot into these Spanish racial categories. So it's a really complex mix. In the case of all of these Latin American revolutions, what we're primarily going to see is Creoles starting to demand their independence from the peninsulares. So they say, look, we're from Spain, basically, we're Portuguese, basically, we speak the same language, we have the same culture, we have money, we have land, but we're not allowed all the same privileges. We're not seen as good because we were born in the Americas. But if this is your goal for the revolution, it's a lot less about sort of social reform or equality or freedom or rights for other people, right? So it is built on these Enlightenment ideas in that Creoles want these things for themselves, but they don't necessarily want them in a broader way. So that can be really problematic because a lot of the Enlightenment ideas posit freedom and democracy and inequality for everybody, whether that's actually followed through with or not. So part of the reason these are going to be successful come right on the heels of the Haitian Revolution. So remember, Napoleon's ripping it up in Europe. He's lost Haiti. His troops were beaten. He sold off his colonies in the Americas. He got some money off of that. Now he's going to take the fight to Spain, Portugal, and eventually to Russia, right, which turns out to be a bad idea. But in Napoleonic Europe, Spain and Portugal are getting a little beat up on. So they don't necessarily have as much money and as much resources to manage the colonies. As they're getting beaten up on, they kind of stop paying attention a little bit to what's happening in the colonies, and the Creoles have more sort of breathing room to expand and to take control of political and military and economic matters. This leads to a bunch of revolts across these sort of fledgling areas in the empire that are starting to have a certain national consciousness. So places like Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela all have revolts in the early 1810s. Even though not all of these revolts are led by Creoles, they're going to all be co-opted by Creoles. In the end, the Creoles are going to be the ones who benefit the most from all of these movements. And this is really common. Often revolutions are started by the poor, or they're started by a certain class or racial group, and then in the end, something different is going to kind of happen. So we could start by looking at Mexico and the sort of origins of Mexican independence. So as it turns out, New Spain, right, Mexico, was already in trouble. They're coming into conflict with the United States. They're sort of losing money, right? They had those silver mines originally that were so productive. Those are kind of slowly drying out. And there's real indigenous movements in Mexico for independence from Europe. So one of the main sort of leaders of these movements is a priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla. There he is in the center there. He is a little bit different than your average Catholic priest that's out there in Mexico. He cares deeply for the people, and he sees how this sort of continuing system of empire is hurting the people of Mexico. Originally, he is speaking to mestizos and indigenous Mexicans. And he's bringing in some of their traditions that have mixed with Christianity, like reverence for the Virgin of Guadalupe. So before Catholics arrived in Mexico, there was already a very strong sort of female deity worshipping cult in the Aztec and Mexican worlds. And this sort of gets transitioned into Mexican thought. Also, this priest is pretty revolutionary, and he says it's okay to do things like kill the Spanish if you have to for the revolution, because you're fighting for your freedom, you're fighting for your life now. So if you have to kill Spanish to kick them out of Mexico so that we can have this revolution, that's okay. The Spanish do not like this, of course. When they get a hold of him, they execute him immediately, but it's too late. There's already this sort of growing open rebellion against Spanish rule. And you have a sort of big coalition. You have mestizos, you have Mexicans, you have different sections of the Catholic Church, and then you start to get Creole support, Creole money. So you have this sort of the highest class under the Spanish and Portuguese, these Creoles, step in to lead the revolution. Well, this isn't maybe so straightforward because they hadn't started it. They didn't necessarily die for it in the beginning. They're kind of jumping on the bandwagon because they're the ones that want rights, and they figure once the Spanish and the Portuguese get kicked out, they're going to be either the next target for these revolutions or they can sort of lead the revolutions. So these leaders add a certain sort of gravitas to the movement, right? They bring money, they bring support from people that are seen as like high class, but somehow also tied to Mexico rather than to Spain. So the movement really gathers steam. And in 1821, these Creole elites essentially declare independence from Spain, and over the next couple of years form a republic. So you can sort of see how it goes from being almost like an indigenous rebellion led by a sort of radical member of the church to kind of getting co-opted. And this sort of remains true in Mexico today, right? The sort of whiter you are, the sort of more connections your family has to Spain, the more sort of political power and money you tend to have. So this doesn't really go away. This stays part of the sort of Mexican elite culture. Other places, it's not so directly from one particular national stance. You have people like Simon Bolivar who run around South America kind of all over. He's like the Che Guevara, like 150 years earlier or something, or 120 years earlier. Bolivar is an Enlightenment thinker. He's a military leader, and he is very moved by all of these independence wars being fought in America and France and Haiti and Mexico. And he wants to sort of help his Latin American brothers and sisters rebel against the empire wherever they may be. So in 1811, he starts to actually physically fight in wars against the Spanish Empire. He has a number of campaigns, notably in Colombia, right? He helps the Colombians break away from the empire, but he ends up fighting in Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru. He gets military and economic aid to Argentina and Chile, There's a state named after him, right? Bolivia. So he's this like weird figure. He's often depicted like a South American, Washington. He didn't play by the rules militarily, and he was just an excellent sort of strategist who really helped people see how they could break away from the Spanish and Portuguese empires. But his idea was that once everybody breaks away, South America would sort of re-federalize. There would be one federated state, like the United States, but like the United States South. And maybe he would be the first president, and maybe each state would have, voting rights and stuff, just like the 13 colonies. The problem was, as he helped all these states break away, um, they started to have their own sort of consciousness. So people in Argentina, people in Chile, people in Ecuador started to feel slightly different than each other, right? It wasn't all like one time, there's different historical circumstances. So they never really want to come together. Once people in Peru break away, they don't necessarily want to join something else. So that sort of dream of a unified South America doesn't work out. Before Bolivar can bring it all together, he gets tuberculosis and dies of that. But he's this amazing revolutionary figure that really helps all of these different states figure out how they're going to get away from the empire. In Brazil, things work a lot differently. It's under that Portuguese system. So remember, there was never one direct sort of colonization of Brazil in the same way that there was in Mexico or Peru. And that has a lot of lasting implications. Um, Brazil was more sort of a patchwork of colonization. Then, as Napoleon is ripping things up in Europe again, it's 1807, the Portuguese are in trouble, so the Portuguese monarchy pack up and the whole monarchy literally moves to Brazil. And they're going to run their government in exile until Napoleon gets sort of deposed. So here you have the Portuguese monarchy has been relocated to Brazil. They're running the empire from Brazil. Napoleon gets beat up at Waterloo. He gets under house arrest. And eventually the Portuguese are going to return to Portugal. So the king is going to return, but it's 14 years later. So they've been living in Brazil for a while. And some of the Portuguese want to stay. Some of the Portuguese sort of aristocrats and royal family. So one in particular was Prince Pedro. He wants to remain in Rio de Janeiro. He likes Brazil, and he doesn't necessarily have a future back in Portugal, right? He's not like in line to inherit the throne right away or anything like that. So he stays in Rio. But here's where stuff starts to get weird. When the Portuguese monarchy leaves, a lot of the local Creoles, these other elites, say, okay, now the monarchy's gone, now we can start to have these same feelings too, these same sorts of push for independence and no more colonization and stuff like that. So these people end up meeting with Pedro to sort of discuss it. And surprisingly, Prince Pedro says, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. So Prince Pedro declares Brazil an independent country. He makes himself the emperor of a new empire, the Empire of Brazil. So this is weird, right? There was no social revolution, no military revolution. The Creoles basically get together with this sort of young member of the royal family who decided to stay and just declare it. The Portuguese really can't do anything about it. They're out of there. They're lucky to have made it back home. Portugal's still kind of messed up from Napoleon. So Prince Pedro is now Emperor Pedro of Brazil and starts it on a whole different track. So it is sort of a revolution. Brazil does kind of break away and all, but not in the same way that other places do it. So here you go. Here's Latin America in 1830. When we looked at Latin America on the eve of revolution, it's like two big empires. Here you have all of these different states. So the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies are pretty much all independent by 1830. There's some leftover, there's some hold on, but not much. as part of these revolutions, you get some new civil, political, economic, social rights, but not everything. A lot of these movements, remember, were for the Creole elite. So the idea was they wanted to be in charge, not Europeans. But they're still Europeans, right? I mean, it's still white folks and their descendants leading these places that have had these revolutions by and large. So there is a new social order. There's new sort of ideas about freedom and democracy. We're going to see in a second that actually slavery is ended in most of these Latin American states. But in terms of the same sort of revolutionary character you see in Haiti or the United States, it's a little bit different. There's a sort of end to colonization, but in terms of who gets rights, there's a sort of broader swath at the top who gets rights, and then other people it gets a lot more hazy. So that kind of leads us into this sense, this question, how successful were these revolutions? Who actually benefited? There's all these new political ideas, new sort of increasing levels of experimentation in terms of freedom, but who really gets to benefit from these wars? Uh, you might start by wondering, well, what were these revolutions designed to do? So there's a lot of, right, that Enlightenment talk, these ideas about freedom, equality, liberty, fraternity, right, coming out of these revolutions. So do people really get it? And who gets it? And it turns out that it's a really complicated question. Some people do get genuine new rights, new freedoms, new liberties, protections from the state. Other people don't at all. But these words also carry a whole set of connotations beyond just what they mean. You know, equality means to be equal or something like this, but it also implies a sort of social and moral character, right, within the state. So people all around the Atlantic are wondering, okay, we've had this revolution, we've got freedom. What does that mean? Where are its boundaries? Who's going to be free? Who's not going to be free? In the case of the United States, great, we have freedom, but not for Black folks, not for Native American folks. So it's messy and it's undecided still. Also, a lot of new sort of political philosophies and ideologies come out of these movements as people go to actually build their states. How much protection are people going to have from the state? How much do they need to contribute to the state? All of these ideas are going to come into play, right? One of the great things to come out of these movements seems to be the abolition of slavery. So we looked at some of this stuff before, and we talked about the transatlantic, slave trade and the sort of beginnings of abolition, but we didn't sort of fully expand that to talk about how they were tied into these Atlantic revolutions. So you could just look at Haiti and be like, well, look, the Haitian revolution just ended slavery on the island. Seems like a success. So that was well before slavery was illegal around the world, right? The Haitians just went for it on their own and just demanded it. But the United States, when they have their revolution, keep slavery. Some of the founding fathers were ambiguous about this, but others not so much. Washington literally wrote that none of his slaves could be freed until after he was dead or whatever, or until his wife was dead. He inherited his first slave at 11, or whatever. So, but so the U.S. is going to keep slavery for quite a long time, right? They're the last holdout, other than Brazil, really, worldwide. We saw a lot of black intellectuals and freedmen fighting the slave trade. Some of those are from France, some of those are from Caribbean, some of those are from Latin America that fight in these revolutions. And when they're fighting in the revolutions, what they're fighting for is freedom for themselves and their community, not necessarily for the broader ideas of some sort of freedom from God or equality for all or something like that, but a much more realistic like freedom today would be nice. We see other people like William Wilberforce, right? Great name. He's the guy here on the left over there. After the Haitian Revolution, right, there's sort of a movement to end slavery broadly. In part, this is because Britain's no longer really, profiting off of slavery that much as we looked at before. And he is successful in getting the British Parliament to actually pass a bill that ends slavery. And again, it's totally cribbed in these Enlightenment terms: liberty, freedom, equality. When you have those sorts of ideas, how can slavery really fit into them? Just on the surface of it, it doesn't seem like it can. And with the passage of this bill, the British Navy actually takes the sort of mandate to try to prevent the transatlantic slave trade from continuing. So they actually blockade ships off of West Africa and the Caribbean, trying to prevent people from transporting slaves. However, the industry thrives in the United States and the Caribbean, kind of going back and forth. So it continues, but from the British perspective, it's no longer okay. As I said just a second ago, too, most Latin American countries had done away with slavery by 1830 or so, but it wasn't necessarily for like humanitarian reasons and because they believed in it and all those sorts of things. In places like Mexico, the idea was to co-opt certain members of society. So it was about sort of keeping power for the Creoles and taking away power from Europeans. The Europeans were the ones that often benefited the most from these systems, so ending those systems would sort of hurt the Europeans financially. Also, big portions of the population were either mixed or black, and freeing slaves, even if it didn't necessarily apply to mestizos or mulatto people, was like seen intellectually as like, something good the state is doing. So it was sort of more of a tactical move by many of these Latin American countries. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment and the sort of revolutions really do seem to kind of start putting nails in the coffin of slavery broadly. What about things like women's rights? So we haven't talked too much about women in these revolutions, but of course, women were deeply involved in all of these revolutions. Here's a bunch of French women going to cut off some heads, in France. So the Enlightenment itself was not necessarily that generous to women. It often depicted women as sort of wives or mothers, or the sort of foundation, sort of cultural base for the state. But there were other women who were picking up these Enlightenment ideas and sort of running with them on their own terms. So you might look at Mary Ashtel, right, who's a really early sort of women's rights advocate before that even has like a term, before that's even a thing. And what she argues is, if absolutism is bad for a government, how can it be good for a family? So if you have a revolution against the king and your argument is, we don't want a king, the people should be able to decide, because the people, right, the government works for the people, it's by the people. So she says, well, okay, same with family, right? In a family, we don't want just one patriarchal figurehead. What's the family is the family, right? What's good for the family is good for the family. So the family should work for the family, right? It shouldn't just work for the patriarchal figurehead, for the husband. It should be more of a communal process. She also compares these things with slavery, right? Why are all men born free but women born slaves? She wasn't saying, oh, women are going to get, whipped for this and that, but her argument was like, I mean, at this time, right, women had very, very few rights in most of these places. So why was that? Why could men argue for their rights, but women couldn't, right? So she's questioning these things, she's arguing these things, and people have to kind of pay attention a little bit, because otherwise they'd just be very hypocritical, right? So they're trying to sort of argue around these. A lot of men don't like these ideas. A lot of the other Enlightenment thinkers don't necessarily like them, but they're there. There's a very famous woman in France during the French Revolution, Olympia de Gauche, who, when the National Assembly releases their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, she writes her own. And she was like, this is garbage. Where's the one for women, right? Why aren't women included in these documents? So she makes her own, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Um, so here's just like a little example. You can pause it and read some of this stuff. It's really crazy what she's throwing out there, right? She's basically writing her own Declaration of Independence, or like kind of constitution, asking for, or not asking for, just saying that women have all the same rights as men, or should, within the state. So her first article is "Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights." And at the time, that was just like mind boggling. She argued that women should be able to sue the father of their child if the father of their child doesn't like pay up or support the family. Women should be subjected to the same laws as men, all this sort of stuff. Um, Women should have rights in divorce, all this. It's just like way, way ahead of its time. So naturally, she's killed as part of the revolution. She's seen as like counter to the revolution, which is kind of crazy because obviously she's pushing the boundaries of the revolution as far as it'll go. She's trying to really figure out, what does this revolution mean for me and for other people like me? And in the end, it meant death, I guess. But it also started a lot of these sorts of conversations that once they're out there, you can't really take them back, right? People were catching on to these ideas. So were these revolutions successful? Here's Washington on parade. Yeah, it looks successful, man. But when you just look at this photo, how well is this actually representing the Americans who won, the Americans who fighted? There's some like Native Americans, like for some reason sitting down, kind of similar, like kind of the side of Washington's horse there. But where are all the black folks? Where are the folks who didn't want to fight? Where are the Mennonites? Who is this state for? Well, clearly it's for elite white folks, right? These don't look like dirt farmers. Um, so what were the goals of the revolution? Well, a lot of the goals of the revolution were freedom, independence, equality, and justice, but for the people who wanted power, for the like elites and middle class who could make those demands. Um, they also weren't the same in every location. As we saw, the sort of actors and agents in the revolution differed from place to place. The results differ from place to place. It's really hard to then determine if they achieved their goals. Did people really have more liberty at the end? Did people really have more freedom? Was there really more democracy? Yeah, for sure. But how do we categorize that? When is it enough? So you can't just look at these revolutions and be like, wow, okay, now you have a new United States and a new, Haitian government, and these were all successful. Mexico broke away, right? Cool. You still can question what were the motivations of these revolutions and who was sort of served by them. So we've seen these Enlightenment ideas inspiring revolutions, radically transforming the social order around the Atlantic world, across the Americas, in France, in the Caribbean. These are going to lead to the creation of these new sort of national bodies that we're going to call nation states. We're going to talk a lot more about those next time. And as we do, we'll try to get a better sense, as these nations are forming, who's included, who's left out, what's the story, why are nation states even a thing, right? So we'll try to get a sense of that and understand how these revolutions lead to the development of sort of states, nations that we understand today. So next time we'll look at the nation states and nationalism. Keep reading the Traditions and Encounters. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Talk to you soon.